For 40 years, Elaine and Gordon Whitaker had given almost everything they had to a small California winery. There were harvest seasons when Gordon left the house before sunrise and came back after dark with dirt on his boots and grape stains on his hands. There were nights when Elaine put 3 children to bed, walked back into the kitchen, and spent another 2 hours answering orders, adding up invoices, and figuring out which bill could wait until Friday. They bottled wine themselves. They packed cases themselves. When money was tight, they fixed what they could instead of replacing it. One year, after a poor harvest, Elaine kept the household grocery money in one envelope and the winery money in another because mixing up the two could mean a check bounced. They weren't thinking about building a legacy back then. They were trying to keep the vineyard going. And they did. 40 years later, Whitaker Vineyards was no longer the little family winery few people outside the valley had heard of. It had become a respected California brand. Much of that growth belonged to their sons, Russell and Colin. The boys had taken what their parents started and carried it farther than Elaine and Gordon ever imagined. Elaine was proud of that. She told people so. Which was why she had been looking forward to the 40th anniversary celebration for months. That evening, she sat beside Gordon beneath warm string lights as employees, longtime customers, distributors, and friends gathered around them. A large screen stood beside the stage. Russell stepped up to the microphone. Then the photographs began. The new tasting room. The expanded vineyards. Awards. Events. Employees Elaine had watched grow into managers. Russell appeared again and again. So did Colin. Elaine smiled. Then she began waiting for the older photographs. The little building they had started in. Gordon beside their first rows of vines. The kitchen table where half the office work used to get done. Maybe one of the 5 of them together when the children were young. The slides kept moving. Elaine's smile didn't disappear. But Audrey, sitting a few seats away, noticed her mother glance at the screen, then down at her folded hands. 40 years of Whitaker Vineyards were being celebrated in front of them. And somehow, the 2 people who had started it were barely in the story. Neither Elaine nor Gordon said a word. They didn't have to. Because before the evening was over, an old customer would point to one forgotten bottle on that screen and ask a question neither Russell nor Colin could answer. Elaine could. 40 years earlier, there wasn't much of a winery to photograph. There was a small house, a weathered shed, a few acres of vines, and a used pickup truck Gordon seemed to repair more often than he drove. Elaine used to joke that the truck had 3 working parts, and Gordon had already replaced 2 of them. Back then, Whitaker Vineyards wasn't really a brand. Most people nearby didn't even know the name. Gordon spent his days learning the land. He checked vines before breakfast, worried about frost in the spring, watched the sky when rain came at the wrong time, and learned quickly that grapes didn't care how tired a man was. Elaine handled whatever Gordon wasn't handling. The phone rang in their kitchen. Orders were written in a notebook beside the refrigerator. Receipts went into a drawer until Elaine had enough quiet to sort them. If someone wanted to stop by and taste the wine, Elaine found clean glasses and made room. Sometimes that meant moving the children's homework off the kitchen table 5 minutes before a customer arrived. Russell and Colin grew up around all of it. So did Audrey, a few years later. They knew the sound of boxes being taped shut. They knew not to touch the stacks of paperwork beside their mother's chair. And they knew that harvest season meant dinner might be late. There were good years. There were also years when Gordon and Elaine sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and went through the bills twice. Once, Gordon looked at the numbers and said, "We can wait another year on the tractor." Elaine looked toward the window. "Gordon, that tractor is older than Russell. It still starts. Sometimes." That was enough to make both of them laugh. They kept going. Not because either of them believed Whitaker Vineyards would someday become well known. A restaurant ordered a few cases. Then another one did. A couple who had stopped by on vacation came back the following summer and brought friends. Elaine remembered their names. Gordon remembered what they liked. Little by little, people returned. Years passed that way. Then the children grew up. Russell came home from college with ideas about distributors, restaurant accounts, and markets Gordon had never considered. Colin started looking at the tasting room and seeing possibilities where his parents mostly saw a room that still needed a new door. Elaine listened to the two brothers talk one evening over dinner. They had plans. A lot of them. Gordon leaned back in his chair and smiled. Elaine did too. Neither parent knew how far their sons would eventually take the little winery. But they were about to find out. Russell did not come home and take over the winery. Gordon would never have allowed that. He started at the bottom. He loaded cases into trucks, made deliveries, worked weekend tastings, and spent hours calling restaurants that usually said no. Russell kept calling anyway. One small restaurant in Sacramento agreed to try 6 cases. A month later, they ordered 12. Russell drove home that afternoon grinning like he'd landed the biggest account in California. Gordon looked at the purchase order. 12 cases. It's a start. It is. That was about as much celebration as Gordon gave him. But Elaine saw him carry the order into the kitchen and leave it beside her coffee cup so she would notice. Colin came into the business differently. He noticed everything customers noticed. The tasting room was too dark. The signs were hard to read. People liked the wine, but there wasn't much reason to stay after their tasting was finished. Colin moved some tables outside. He added weekend reservations. He worked with local food vendors. Later, he helped redesign the tasting room and gave visitors a place where they wanted to spend an afternoon instead of 20 minutes. The brothers were good together. Russell knew how to get Whitaker wine into new places. Colin knew how to make people remember where it came from. They disagreed, of course. Russell wanted to move faster. Colin wanted to get things right before expanding. Gordon usually listened until one of them asked what he thought. Then he'd say, "Ask your mother." Elaine hated when he did that. But she was usually the one who could get the 4 of them back to the same table. Over the years, the changes became harder to miss. More restaurant accounts. A growing wine club. A larger tasting room. New equipment. More employees. Then awards began appearing on the wall. Whitaker Vineyards was no longer the place people happened to find while driving through the valley. People started coming there on purpose. Elaine never had trouble saying who deserved the credit. "The boys took this place farther than we ever could," she told customers more than once. And she meant it. Gordon meant it too. They had started something small. Russell and Colin had learned how to make it grow. Audrey took a different path. She helped when the family needed her, but the winery never became her whole life the way it had for her brothers. Maybe that was why she sometimes noticed things they missed. Because while Russell and Colin were learning how to tell the Whitaker story to more and more people, one small part of that story was quietly becoming harder to see. The first Whitaker label was never supposed to become anything special. Elaine made it because they had bottles to sell, and those bottles needed something on the front. That was about as much thought as anyone gave it. It happened one evening at the kitchen table. Gordon had spent most of the day outside. Elaine had finished the invoices after dinner, and the children were supposed to be getting ready for bed. Russell and Colin were still arguing over something in the hallway. Elaine had a sheet of paper in front of her. She wrote the winery name across the top. Whitaker Vineyards. Then she tried it again. The second version looked better. Gordon came into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. "What are you doing?" "We need labels." He looked over her shoulder. Elaine had drawn a few simple lines beneath the name. Nothing fancy. Just enough to keep the bottle from looking bare. Gordon studied it for a moment. "Looks fine to me." Elaine turned around. "You didn't even look at it." "I looked. For 3 seconds. How long am I supposed to look at a label?" Elaine laughed. "Good. Because that's what we're using." A small printer in town helped turn her sketch into something they could actually put on the bottles. The paper was plain. The lettering was simple. Nobody discussed colors for 3 weeks or hired someone to explain what the design was supposed to mean. They had other things to worry about. The wine mattered. The label just told people whose wine it was. For the first few years, that little design appeared on every bottle they sold. Then Whitaker Vineyards grew. The label changed. A designer cleaned up the lettering. Later, Colin helped modernize it again. The bottles became more polished. The logo became easier to recognize from across a store shelf. Elaine liked the improvements. One afternoon, Colin showed her a new version and waited for her opinion. She held the bottle at arm's length. "Well, that looks like a real winery." Colin laughed. "What did it look like before?" "Your mother with a pencil." That was the whole conversation. No one asked who had designed the first one. Elaine never thought to mention it. Russell and Colin had been children when she made it. Audrey was even younger. To them, that old bottle was simply one of the early Whitaker bottles. And to Elaine, the label was just another small job that had needed doing. 40 years later, one of those bottles would appear on a giant screen. And someone in the audience would remember it far better than the Whitakers expected. By the time Whitaker Vineyards reached its 20th year, people had started asking Russell to tell the family story. At first, he told it the way everyone remembered it. His parents bought a few acres. Gordon learned the vines. Elaine kept everything else moving. The children grew up around boxes, bottles, and customers coming through the kitchen. Then Russell and Colin came into the business and helped it grow. It was a good story. It was also a long one. As the winery became better known, the story had to fit into smaller places. A newspaper wanted 3 paragraphs. A restaurant wanted 2 sentences for its wine list. The new website needed a short About Us page. A distributor in Los Angeles wanted something their sales team could remember. Little by little, 40 years became 10 lines. Then 6. The early years were often reduced to a phrase. Founded as a small family vineyard. After that came the parts Russell and Colin knew best. The expanded production. The wine club. The new tasting room. The restaurant accounts. The awards. None of it was untrue. Elaine read the new website when it went live. Colin had sent her the link. "What do you think?" he asked later. "It looks nice." "That's it?" Elaine laughed. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something motherly. Make sure everything's spelled right." Colin shook his head. "Very helpful." Elaine liked the website. She especially liked the photographs of the vineyard at sunset. She didn't mention that there was almost nothing about those first years. She didn't think there needed to be. The boys were running the winery now. They were the ones customers saw at events and distributors called with questions. Gordon seemed to feel the same way. Whenever someone praised what Whitaker had become, he usually pointed toward his sons and said, "Talk to those two." Years passed. Old photographs stayed in boxes. New photographs went online. Russell stood beside chefs, distributors, and employees. Colin appeared at tastings and harvest dinners. Elaine and Gordon appeared less often. Then planning began for the 40th anniversary. Russell wanted the evening to feel special. He and Colin hired a local team to put together photographs, old advertisements, awards, and a presentation showing how Whitaker Vineyards had grown. Elaine wasn't asked to help. Russell simply thought they already had everything they needed. Most of the material came from the winery's existing files. The recent years were easy. There were thousands of photographs. The early years were different. Most of those pictures were still somewhere at Elaine and Gordon's house. Nobody thought much about that. A week later, the anniversary celebration arrived. By late afternoon, Whitaker Vineyards looked better than Elaine had ever seen it. Long tables stretched across the patio. White tablecloths moved gently in the breeze. String lights hung above the courtyard. Beyond them, rows of vines ran toward the low California hills. Elaine stood beside Gordon near the tasting room entrance. She watched Russell greet a distributor from San Francisco. Colin was helping an older couple find their table. "Look at them," Elaine said. Gordon followed her eyes. "They clean up pretty well." "I meant the winery." "I know what you meant." Elaine nudged his arm. Audrey arrived a few minutes later and hugged them both. Then Elaine saw the anniversary display. She walked over slowly. 40 years of Whitaker vineyards filled the wall. There were awards she remembered celebrating. Pictures from harvest dinners. The tasting room expansion. Russell shaking hands with restaurant owners. Colin standing beside employees. Elaine smiled at several of them. Then she reached the earliest section. She stopped. Gordon appeared once. Elaine found herself in the corner of an old group photograph. She leaned closer. "That's a terrible picture of me." Audrey had come up beside her. "I think you look nice. You need glasses." Elaine smiled and moved on. Audrey didn't. She looked at the wall, then at her mother walking back toward Gordon. A few minutes later, the lights around the stage dimmed. Russell stepped up to the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming. Elaine took Gordon's hand as the first slide appeared behind him. She was ready to hear her family's story. Audrey, sitting 3 seats away, wasn't watching the screen yet. She was watching her mother. Russell was good at this. He didn't need notes for most of the presentation. He knew when the first restaurant in Sacramento had put Whitaker on its wine list. He remembered the year they expanded the tasting room, the first distributor who took a chance on them, and the harvest that nearly doubled their wine club. When a photograph of the old tasting room appeared, Russell smiled. "Some of you probably remember this place." Several people laughed. It seated about 12 people comfortably. 15 if nobody wanted to move. More laughter. Elaine leaned toward Gordon. "He's being generous." Gordon nodded. 10. Russell moved through the years. He thanked employees by name. He pointed out people in the audience who had been customers for 20 or 30 years. When Colin appeared in a photograph covered in dust during the tasting room renovation, Russell stopped. "I promised him this picture wouldn't make it into the presentation." Colin called from his table. "You lie for a living." The room laughed again. Elaine laughed with them. Her boys had done well. There was no other way to put it. They had taken the little winery she and Gordon once worried might not make it through another year and turned it into something neither parent had known how to build. Then Russell clicked to another slide. An old photograph filled the screen. A single bottle stood on a wooden table. The glass was darker than the bottles Whitaker used now. The label was cream-colored, with simple lettering and a few uneven lines beneath the name. Elaine sat a little straighter. Gordon squinted at the screen. "That's old." Elaine smiled. "Very." Russell glanced behind him. "And this is one of the first bottles Whitaker ever sold." A few longtime customers murmured at their tables. Someone near the back said, "I remember that." Russell smiled and moved on. The next slide showed a newer bottle. Then came the tasting room expansion. Another award. Another harvest. Elaine kept listening. But Audrey looked toward the back of the room. An older man had leaned toward his wife and was whispering something while pointing at the screen. A few minutes later, Russell finished to warm applause. He thanked everyone again, then handed the microphone to the evening's host. The host smiled at the crowd. "We've got a few minutes. Anybody have a question, a complaint, or a story Russell would prefer you didn't tell?" Hands went up. The room laughed. Then the older man near the back raised his hand. "Could you put that old bottle back on the screen?" Russell turned toward him. "The first one?" "That's the one." The photograph returned. The man looked at it for a moment. Then he smiled. Seeing that again reminds me of something I've always wondered. The older man waited until someone brought him a microphone. He looked up at the bottle on the screen. My wife and I bought that wine the first Christmas we lived here, he said. We didn't know anything about wine back then. His wife touched his arm. You still don't. The room laughed. He nodded. That's fair. Even Russell laughed. The man pointed toward the screen. But I remember that bottle. We bought it again the next year. Who came up with that label? Russell turned and looked at the photograph. For a second, he seemed to expect the answer to be written somewhere on the slide. Then he looked at Colin. Colin shook his head. Russell smiled. You know, I have absolutely no idea. That got another small laugh. Russell looked toward his parents. Dad? Gordon lifted both hands. Don't look at me. The laughter grew. Elaine lowered her head, smiling. Audrey saw it. It wasn't the same smile Elaine had worn during Russell's presentation. This one was smaller. Almost private. Audrey leaned forward. Mom? Elaine looked over. Audrey pointed toward the screen. Was that you? Elaine blinked. The label? Yeah. Elaine looked back at the old bottle. For a moment, she seemed surprised anyone was asking. Then she gave a little shrug. Oh, honey. I suppose it was. Russell turned toward her. You designed that? Elaine laughed. I wouldn't call it designing. Colin was staring at the screen now. Mom, seriously? We needed something to put on the bottles. That answer brought another ripple of laughter from the tables around them. Russell looked at Colin. Neither brother seemed embarrassed. They looked genuinely interested. Audrey stood. Mom, you have to tell this. Elaine immediately shook her head. No, I don't. Yes, you do. Audrey. Russell stepped down from the stage with the microphone in his hand. Come on, Mom. Elaine looked at Gordon for help. He smiled. Don't look at me. Now even Elaine laughed. Colin pulled her chair back so she could stand. Russell offered her his hand for the short step onto the stage. A moment later, Elaine Whitaker was standing beneath the anniversary lights with a microphone she had never asked for. Behind her was the simple cream-colored label she had made at her kitchen table 40 years earlier. She looked at the photograph, then out at the crowd. There's really not much of a story. The older customer smiled. Well, we'd still like to hear it. Elaine looked at the old bottle behind her. Well, Gordon and I had finally made enough wine to sell, she said. Then somebody pointed out that we probably shouldn't hand people a plain bottle and expect them to remember where it came from. Gordon called from his table. That somebody was you. Elaine smiled. That sounds like me. The room laughed. She explained that there had been no designer. No marketing meeting. No discussion about what Whitaker Vineyards was supposed to look like. There had been a kitchen table. A pencil. And 3 children who were supposed to be getting ready for bed. I wrote the name a few times until one version looked better than the others. Then I added those little lines underneath. She turned toward the screen. I'm not sure what those were supposed to be. The older customer laughed. I always thought they were vines. Elaine looked at him. Then let's say they were vines. That got one of the biggest laughs of the evening. Elaine told them about the small printer in town who turned her drawing into a real label. They used it because it was simple, affordable, and ready when they needed it. That was really all there was to it. Russell stood near the edge of the stage, looking up at the photograph. I can't believe we never knew that. Elaine shrugged. There wasn't much to know. The older customer still had his microphone. He raised it again. There was to us. The room became quieter. He looked toward Elaine. My wife was talking about that bottle a minute ago. After that first Christmas, we started bringing one to her parents' house every year. His wife nodded. Her father always opened it before dinner. A woman at another table lifted her hand. I remember that label too. My parents kept one of those bottles on top of their refrigerator. Someone else called out. The cream-colored one. That's it. Another longtime customer remembered buying a case for a wedding. Then another remembered visiting the old tasting room when there had barely been enough chairs. Elaine stood there listening. 40 years earlier, she had worried that the lettering might be crooked. Now people she hadn't seen in years were attaching birthdays, Christmas dinners, weddings, and family visits to that same little piece of paper. Colin walked closer to the screen. He studied the old label as though he were seeing it for the first time. In a way, he was. Then a man near the back called out. You ought to bring that one back. A few people agreed. Then several more. Russell looked at Colin. Before either brother could answer, the evening's host stepped forward with a grin. He had been listening too. The host stepped beside Elaine and looked around the room. All right, he said. I'm hearing a lot of opinions from people who aren't responsible for actually making the wine. Russell folded his arms. Now you know how my life feels. The room laughed. The host pointed toward the old bottle still filling the screen. Let's make this simple. Completely unofficial poll. He turned toward the guests. Suppose Whitaker brought back that original label. Same old look, new release. How many of you would actually buy a bottle? For a second, only a few hands went up. Then more followed. The older customer raised both of his. His wife pulled one of them back down. You only get one vote. More laughter. Elaine turned to look behind her. Hands were going up across the patio. Some belonged to customers she remembered from years ago. Others belonged to people she had never met. Even a few employees raised theirs. Russell looked at Colin. Colin was already counting rows. The host noticed. See that, Russell? Russell smiled. I see it. No. Your customers are making the business decisions. I'm just holding the microphone. He glanced at all the hands still raised. Although, Russell, if this thing sells out, I expect a commission. The room broke into laughter. Russell pointed at him from the stage. Now I know what this was really about. Hey, I'm just recognizing an opportunity. That was enough. The host moved on, and Elaine returned to her seat beside Gordon. He leaned toward her. Look at you. 40 years later and you're finally in marketing. Elaine gave him a look. I made one label. Apparently a good one. I made a cheap one. Gordon smiled. People seemed to disagree. Across the table, Audrey was watching her brothers. Russell and Colin weren't laughing anymore. Not because anything was wrong. They were looking around the patio, quietly taking in how many people had raised their hands. Later that evening, after the last speech and the final toast, Russell found Elaine near the tasting room. Mom. She turned. He nodded toward the screen, where the old bottle was still showing between photographs. Did you really never tell us about that? Elaine thought for a moment. I didn't know there was anything to tell. Russell looked back at the bottle. The next morning, that answer was still on his mind. Russell was already at the winery when Colin arrived the next morning. There were 2 cups of coffee on the desk. Colin picked up one. This mine? Unless you want mine. What's in yours? Black. Then this is mine. Audrey arrived a few minutes later with a paper bag of breakfast sandwiches. Gordon and Elaine came in behind her. Elaine looked around the office. Did I miss a meeting invitation? Russell smiled. There wasn't one. Good. I thought I was getting old. Gordon pulled out a chair. You are getting old. So are you. That's different. Audrey put the sandwiches on the table. For a while, they talked about the anniversary. The turnout had been better than expected. The caterer had done well. Russell was happy with the distributor conversations. Then Colin brought up the show of hands. How many do you think went up? Russell leaned back. Most of the room. That's what I thought. Audrey unwrapped her sandwich. They weren't just raising their hands for the label. Russell looked at her. What do you mean? They remembered it. Nobody answered right away. Audrey looked at Elaine. They remembered where they were when they bought those bottles. Christmas. Weddings. Their parents' houses. Elaine took the lid off her coffee. I was surprised by that. Russell nodded. Then he looked at his mother. Mom, what else don't we know? Elaine stopped with the cup halfway to her mouth. I don't know what you don't know. Gordon laughed. We'd better start at the beginning, then. That took them back to the house. Elaine found 2 old boxes in a hallway closet. Gordon brought another one from the garage. They spread everything across the dining room table. Photographs. Old invoices. Restaurant orders. Handwritten customer notes. A faded tasting room flyer. Russell picked up a photograph of Gordon standing beside an old pickup. You actually delivered wine in this thing? Gordon frowned. That was a good truck. Elaine looked over. That truck was a public nuisance. Colin laughed. For the next 2 hours, the brothers asked questions. Not business questions. Family questions. Who was this? Where was that taken? Why did Mom write customer names in the margins of the order book? Audrey mostly listened. Near the bottom of the second box, Colin found an old Whitaker bottle. The cream-colored label was still there. He set it carefully in the middle of the table. Russell looked at it. Then at the photographs spread around it. Then at his parents. What if we brought it back? This time, nobody laughed. 3 months later, the old label was back. Not on an old bottle. Russell had been very clear about that. The wine was new. So was the release. Only the label had come back. On the outside was the same simple cream-colored design Elaine had put together at her kitchen table 40 years earlier. They called it the Whitaker Heritage Release. Colin had resisted the temptation to clean up the design too much. He fixed what was necessary for printing, but the uneven little lines stayed. So did the plain lettering. When he showed Elaine the finished bottle, she turned it slowly in her hands. You left those lines. Colin smiled. Apparently people like your vines. Elaine looked at him. They were never vines. I know. On the back was one sentence Russell had insisted on adding. Original label designed by Elaine Whitaker, 1986. Elaine read it twice. Then she handed the bottle to Gordon. That makes it sound like I knew what I was doing. Gordon studied the label. You fooled everybody for 40 years. Elaine laughed. The Heritage release sold well. But something else had changed too. The anniversary wall inside the tasting room had been updated. There were still photographs of Russell and Colin. The awards were still there. So were the expansions and the people who had helped build Whitaker into what it was. But now the beginning had more room. There was Gordon beside the old pickup. Elaine at the kitchen table. 3 children standing between their parents in front of the original building. And one photograph of that first bottle. Audrey stood with her mother the first time they saw the new display. Better? She asked. Elaine studied it. Your hair was terrible. Audrey stared at her. Mom. Elaine smiled and slipped an arm through her daughter's. A few weeks later, Elaine was in the tasting room when a young woman picked up a bottle of the Heritage release. She couldn't have been more than 30. She turned it around, then back again. I love this label, she said. Elaine looked at the cream-colored paper. 40 years earlier, it had been one more thing to finish before bedtime. Now it was here again. "So do I," she said. 40 years earlier, Elaine had made that label because a bottle needed a name on it. She never imagined anyone would remember it. But families can be like that. Sometimes the things that matter most aren't lost. They simply haven't been asked about yet. What do you think Russell and Colin learned that night? And is there a story about your own parents or grandparents that you've never thought to ask them about? Tell us in the comments.